Made it. I was starting to. Did you find it?
Yeah.
Okay. It does hit record, and it doesn't look like a row. If you could sit just in case anybody does come in such a way to see both of us. I wish we had a better way of testing sound without having a person.
Oh,
So, what do you think of this chapter?
oh, actually, I didn't get that. Yeah.
Okay.
I keep forgetting to require community class. I keep thinking we'll go over it Mondays.
Well, we kind of are.
I shouldn't count on only going over it on Mondays.
We will. So that's fine. So this chapter, I usually say that in most classes where we study like an aspect of communication, like in this case, we're studying intercultural communication, that we don't really get into it until midterm. That's usually what I think, is we spend most of the time kind of setting a stage for what is communication, what are we doing here, and this certainly a chapter that does that. But I feel like it also moves into communication, or all into intercultural communication. Actually starts to deal with what is culture in a fairly serious way. So that's what I think is going on. Let's go ahead and share screen. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my privacy and put it on there as what I'm showing. So the chapter starts out by defining culture, or defining communication. Kind of asks these questions: what is communication? How do you know if you communicated? Those types of things. And it really takes it out. It gives you three, and to a certain extent, it just kind of puts the second thing together. It kind of gives you a couple of different ways to look at communication. And one is the first one that we call the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. And you've probably seen this before, but it's been a while. I think I usually talk about it even in our basic public speaking class. And it's sort of what communication, it's kind of a simple model of communication. There's some problems with it. But the idea is that you kind of start out and you've got your source of information, maybe you yourself. If you are the communicator, your source of information, and that you put together a message, and that message is sent to a receiver, right? Who then processes the information into his or her brain, and then maybe feeds back. This model is, like I said, it's called the Shannon and Weaver model. From what I understand, Shannon and Weaver were people who worked for AT&T. We're trying to figure out a way to create a model that would describe what was going on with a telephone receiver. And in that case, it's pretty good, right? You've got the transmitter on one end, the receiver on the other, people on either side of that. It works pretty good. Works pretty well for that. And how do you know if communication is taking place? Well, did you hear it? Well, then it's taken place. And if there's any problem, for the longest time, we call it noise. They say it's noise if you're hungry, so you can't really. It's noise, and we would just call anything that gets in the way of communication noise. And we would see this as communication, just kind of the back and forth of messages. Thing is, there's kind of more to communication. I mean, sometimes you can, hi, Jose. I don't know if you got the message, but we're meeting in my office in Bowden Hall if you wanted to come down here. I sent it out as an announcement. So, you know where I'm at? I'm not getting audio from you if you do. Anyway, but I see you there. So anyway, yeah, this is kind of this is the way we look at communication for a long time, and that's kind of even I think when I was in undergrad, I think that's basically what they told me communication was. We pretty much looked at it that way, but now we start to look at it, and we have kind of some views that maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. And we start to look at this is a model that comes from Ogden and Richards. That communication has to do with something more than that. I'll go ahead and I'll share the screen. The communication is kind of making sense of your reality, right? And instead of a sender and a receiver making sense of reality, or just giving messages back and forth, we're sharing reality. That's actually from the concept that they deal with is this book right here. Meaning. And you can see this is the original, where they kind of have this idea that you've got a symbol, right? In this case, and on this, go ahead and put this up here too. In this case, yeah, you can see it. You've got a symbol. So that symbol is a word. Right? A word. It can be a gesture. It can be clothes you wear. It can be about anything. So you've got this symbol, and the symbol then, go ahead and take it back to it, corresponds not to an object or an action or anything like that, but to an idea. So that, if I say cat, what comes to mind is a particular cat, particular feelings I have about cats. And if I say there's a cat, certain things come to my mind, and they are different than the things that come to your mind. And if I just say, do you have your audio on yet, Jose? You got to somehow set your audio, so I can see you're here, but I can't hear you. But anyway, if I say cat, what color is the cat in your head? It's black. It's black in my head too. So that's interesting. I saw a cat. Both of us think of black cats. So long fur, short fur. Yeah, I think short fur. If I say I saw a cat, but so we have this idea in our head, right? But there's also this kind of generic thing. If I say there is a cat and I point to it, and it's not exactly what you have in your head, we can share this idea, right? We can share this idea. Like if I tell you to go get the lion off my shelf over there, you could do that, even though you might have a different idea of what a lion is than I do. If I say a lion, you think of something else. But we can both refer, because that's an actual thing, and it corresponds probably close enough to what a lion is in both of our heads in order to make sense. But sometimes that's not what happens. Sometimes I'll tell you, go get that lion, and you're like, lion's over there. Or sometimes, you might have a particular idea, and your idea associated with something and somebody else's idea associated with something are different. Right? So you use the same word, but but since the ideas in your head are different, even though you're using the same word, it doesn't correspond to the same object, or the same action, the same thing going on in a non-verbal, non-psychological reality.
What's that?
What?
That what is like the term for an object not being kind of suspected or not being there?
Well, I'm pretty sure Richards would call it misunderstanding.
Okay.
Richards kind of famously defined rhetoric as misunderstanding and its remedies. And it's all about misunderstanding. And I think that's what he would call it. But it happens a lot. And so what communication is in this model is a transaction in which we try to use symbols to come to a shared meaning. So you can see that's different than that Shannon-Weaver model, right? So that Shannon-Weaver model, if I told you, we communicate. This model that we're looking at here, this model that we're looking at here, isn't about me just getting a message to you. It's about us coming to a shared meaning. And that's a different thing. Because when we first communicate, we don't always have a shared meaning. And even that, when he said, how would you define that? And I said, well, Richards would define it as misunderstanding. Okay, but even if I say, oh, we had a misunderstanding, you might think of something else as misunderstanding, other than, the reason I said Richards would call it that is because for him, misunderstanding is a theoretical, rhetorical communication concept, right? Whereas a lot of times, we just had a misunderstanding, and that's why I have a black eye. And that's, we'll use that term, misunderstanding, as the language, the symbol, misunderstanding. But then that makes us have different thoughts. Reality, the reality, which can be a different thing. So let's turn back to the view of communication. Views communication as being a way that we can come together to arrive at shared meaning. And that's probably, in a lot of ways, a better understanding of communication. Just the Shannon-Weaver model, which is also sometimes called the sender-receiver model. You just have a sender, sends it through a channel to a receiver, it either hits or missing. And if somebody doesn't understand you, it's because of noise, right? Well, no, if somebody doesn't understand you, it's because they might have a different world. They might understand things differently. They might have different experiences. And it happens all the time. Well, my wife will a lot of times will say, "Oh, I need to go do something." And I generally, even though I've lived with her for all these years, I think that means she needs to go do something. What she means by that, I would symbolize as this thing needs to be done. And so if she tells me I need to go to the store, take that as to go to the store. What she's saying to me is there's a lot of things I need to do. One of them is going to the store. If you could maybe do that, it would be great. So she's actually asking me to go to the store, but she's saying she's doing it. So this we have this misunderstanding. So she uses a set of symbols. I would take that set of symbols to something else. We do that a lot. And it tends to get more complicated in intercultural situations, where a set of symbols can be really, really different depending on what's going on. I was talking today with a student who had learned about something that happened a couple of years ago here, where do you remember when Light Hall was being renovated, or was it renovated?
It was renovated when I got here.
When you got here. Okay, so the business department's been over there in Light Hall since you got here.
Yes.
All right. They were in Light Hall before then too. They've been in Light Hall for a very long time, as long as I've been here, except for 1 year, when Light Hall was really bad when I came. Like, it was comically bad. I wish that I had taken videos. But imagine a movie, and you know those movies like where they go into abandoned places and there are ghosts or whatever, like that. It was like that. Everything was kind of there were doors sitting off their hinges. Everybody was using this building. There were doors sitting off their hinges. The desks were all kind of like mismatched grade school, high school desks, and table and chairs here and there. It's just like everything was just like piled in there, whatever. It was covered. It had carpet, not the hardwood that it has now. It had carpet, and the carpet was, had huge patches where it had been burned away, or just like all kinds. It was a horrible situation. They didn't have any whiteboards. They had blackboards in there, and those blackboards weren't even real blackboards. They were pieces of plywood that had been painted with that stuff that you can use for a blackboard. Just really bad. It looked like the lights would go all the time. There was inconsistent electricity, which also affected the elevator, which was broken just as a general rule. Another thing that affected the elevator and the electricity were there were holes in the ceiling, because there were also holes in the roof. The holes are the ceiling where water had dripped in and then rotted the ceiling clean. It was just really bad. And it's one of the oldest buildings on campus. And it's a historic building. It's some really important historical aspects, right? So, yeah, it was just was really bad. And so they decided to remodel it. It's actually really nice. It's probably one of the nicest buildings we have now. They decided to remodel it. And that meant that the business office, all the business professors had to go somewhere. And they went, and so Dr. Shepard was looking at where they could go, where they would fit, and he decided that he would temporarily, for just 1 year, put them over in the Mecca. I'll go ahead and get to this. Okay, so he decided I'm going to go ahead and put them in the Mecca. You know where that is, right? Right by the police. And in order to do that, he combined the Mecca, the student organization, with the Native American student organization, put them into one space and let the business offices be in the rest, which meant that the Native American organization had to move. Now, as far as Dr. Shepard was concerned, as far as Dr. Shepard was concerned, he had a different concept. In both cases, no matter what, the business office moved into the space and the Native American moved out. For him, this is just like, okay, just a temporary movement of resources. But for the Native American student organization, making the Native Americans give up their space and move had really horrible connotations, right? Because Native Americans have historically had to give up their space and move when the authorities tell them to. And there are, horrible things, the movement to the reservations, the Trail of Tears, one of the worst things that's ever happened. And all of these things, and the way they saw it was Dr. Shepard is doing this again. And they did sit-ins. They refused their space. They fought, they argued. They said, you can't do this. And eventually they all had to sleep. And while they were gone, Dr. Shepard sent maintenance in to move all their stuff into the other room and move business in. And for him, this is just an allocation of space and resources. This is a temporary thing. It's going to be, but for them, it was a perpetuation of historical injustice. And so you have the same term. You're going to have to move. You have the same reality. They are in a different place. But you have really different concepts, really different meaning that's being arrived at in these two situations. So I thought I hadn't really thought about that for years since it happened. It was 4 or 5 years. I hadn't really thought about it for the longest time. But the student came in. She was talking about how she had been talking to person who was working on something else. And she was returned. And she said, and they told us about Dr. Shepard's occupation of the building. And like those are different words. And I'm pretty sure Dr. Shepard would ever he would not talk about the time when he said we to occupy the building. That wouldn't make sense. Um, and in fact, he would say that those aren't terms that even make sense in this situation. WNMU occupies the whole campus. You know, if you want to move parts of the campus from one area to another, it doesn't matter. And so it was that he would even say those words don't make sense. Those words don't describe the real situation. And they would say, no, those words do describe the situation. It's just an interesting thing, and something that that really brings home how in intercultural situations, two people can be doing the same thing, and it has different meaning. And so this kind of understanding of communication, if you go back to just the Shannon Weaver model, and we talk about intercultural communication. In that situation, all we really need to achieve intercultural communication is if we don't speak the same language, we need to translate it. And then we always achieve intercultural communication. And in this model, all sides are successful. When the Native American group was successful in telling Dr. Shepard they didn't want to move. And Dr. Shepard was successful in telling them they had to move anyway. But in this kind of communication, more of a transactional model, shared meaning, it's different. So that's one model. Another model of communication is to see communication as a constituent of culture. What that means is that communication is what culture is made of. Culture is made out of people communicating. And so culture and communication are very tightly related then. What makes that a corner? Yeah. So, right. So it makes it a corner. The corner wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the wall. But a wall wouldn't be there if it didn't have corners. They kind of make each other. And that's this is the way we see communication and culture as constituent. You don't have a culture unless you have communication. Communication creates the culture. You also don't have communication unless you have a culture in which to communicate. It doesn't work. You just can't. And so this is a third view. So we've got the Shannon Weaver model, and we've got I.A. Richards model. And then we've got this constituent view of communication, which we could maybe probably see as a Marxist model. Really play it down to who kind of sees things this way. Karl Marx is, of course, famous for inventing communism. So that's what he did. But he had some views of language, his view of communication. And Karl Marx's view of communication was that communication creates culture, and culture creates communication, and that this creation is done in such a way for what Marx was really worried about was they create each other in such a way as to keep powerful people powerful. That was Marx's primary concern. If we, is that culture is designed to create communication that is designed to reconstruct the culture, that reconstructs that keeps everything kind of going. Not everybody would necessarily take his concern that it's always going to reify the powers in place, but a lot of people would say, but it's still true that culture and communication create each other. So those are kind of the three different views of communication. And then we have to figure out then what is culture. And that is a really, really hard thing to figure out. I have friends in the discipline, in the communication discipline, who collect definitions of culture. It used to be a kind of a popular thing, and I think maybe as more things became electronic, it didn't get quite to be, it stopped being quite as cool. As it was kind of a thing. Whenever they'd find the definition of culture, they would photocopy the page and then cut it out and kind of scrapbook it. So this was a fairly popular thing to do well into the 90s. But I kind of think now, I don't know, I haven't really talked to anybody. Do you still keep your books of culture? I think now with electronic situations, it might not be quite as cool to have your little book with definitions of culture. Because if we take any articles in communication, in sociology, in anthropology, in probably something else. Those are the ones that come to mind right away. Communication, sociology, anthropology. You're going to see almost every article has a definition of culture. And they're not the same. One researcher will define it one way, and one researcher will define it another. And to a large extent, your definition of culture comes from what you want to do with your research. What is it you're trying to prove? Well, sometimes you define culture in such a way that you can prove it. You can prove certain. I want to prove that that culture makes people go to jail. I'll define culture in such a way that I can take this definition of culture and apply it to those groups who are a jail. I want to prove that culture is not a factor in something, then I can define culture in such a way that it turns out it's not a factor in that. And so, to a large extent, that's kind of has to do with what it does. But there going to be a few kind of groups that we can put all of these definitions in. One group takes the definition of culture as being people. And we can talk about Hispanic culture. Well, who's in the Hispanic culture? Hispanic people. And if you aren't a Hispanic person, then you're not part of the Hispanic culture. If you are a Hispanic person, you are part of the Hispanic culture. You can talk about Anglo culture the same way. You can talk about WNMU culture. At Western, we have a Western New Mexico University. We talk about a lot of times. We want to have a culture of assessment, which we but a culture of assessment needs to be in this. So we're trying to build this culture of assessment and try to add WNMU. We can say, everybody here does assessment. And so how do we define that? Well, first we've got to define a WNMU culture. Well, the people who attend or are employed by WNMU. And that just becomes the people. And then if they are those people, they are part of the culture. And a lot of times we do use culture. Somebody said, culture, how do you define yourself culturally? A lot of times you'll start to say, well, I'm part of this group of people. That's one way of defining culture, and a lot of times we'll see definitions of culture that function around that. Another thing that we'll sometimes use to define culture is that cultures are tied to certain structures. That cultures are fit around meanings, values, norms, beliefs. When we say we're trying to instill at WNMU a culture of assessment, what we mean is we're trying to instill a set of norms that most people think of doing assessment. We try beliefs that assessment is good, values that we see, what is measured as being valuable. And so then we would say anybody who shares these norms, these beliefs, these values, these ways of life are a part of the culture, and people can kind of come and go from it. This is the definition I give. A lot of times I'll use the definition as templates for living as culture, so that I didn't decide this. Never entered my head. Maybe I could wear a skirt. And it's like, should I wear a skirt? Never once entered my head, because my culture, my templates for living, already put these norms, beliefs, attitudes on that it would not be normal for me to wear a skirt. That would violate norms. And so I didn't even consider it. It's just this template for living. Now I can violate the template. I can say, you know what, my culture is telling me I should do this, but I'm not going to do it. But even still, the template's still there. That there's just kind of a default way of living. And that's your culture. And so a lot of people use that kind of. Sometimes behavior and artifacts. You kind of define a culture around people who do certain things and who have certain things. One famous instance of that is, of course, well, specifically his taco bowl.
I didn't dig into it.
Yeah, his taco bowl. Yeah. He fairly famously, a few years ago, ate a taco bowl on Cinco de Mayo to show that he loved Hispanic people.
No. Not just the food.
No. And, first of all, all kinds of problems. The taco bowl was pretty American. It's not really. I don't think you can go down to Mexico and order taco bowl. And so all kinds of problems with this. But this idea that what makes a particular culture, well, it's the food they're eating, it's their behaviors, it's the cars they drive, the way they cut their hair. That is the culture. And so, if it is Mexican food, I am now a part of Mexican culture. And so these behaviors and artifacts become the definition of the culture. How do you know it's a culture? Because you behave in a particular way. You have particular things. So those are all different ways that people define culture. And then kind of the last definition of culture, some people define culture as a verb. Culture is something you do. when you get together with people to advocate for a particular thing, that thing you're advocating for is your culture. And this is a kind of lends itself to like the critical paradigm, you remember, that we talked about before. It really lends itself to that, because then culture is what we try and make happen, right? And so that thing we're trying to make happen is culture. And whatever we're trying to make happen, that is culture. And so all of those are kind of different definitions. They can all be used. None of them are wrong. You can't. Yeah, you can't say this. You can't say this is wrong, or you can't say that's right, or you can't. Well, it's all of them. No, it's not, because they're all wrong in some way. Yeah, there's really not. And that's why they keep ending up being all these definitions of culture. Is there's not like just one like this is what culture is. And in that way, it reminds me of pornography. There's a famous quote from Potter Stewart, who was really good at famous quotes. He was a Supreme Court justice. He started definitely during the 60s. He was one. But in the United States, pornography is illegal. But of course, we've all seen it, right? And part of the reason is that we've all seen it, and so it's illegal, but still seems to be everywhere, is because it's really, really hard to define what is hardcore pornography. And so he said in one of his opinions, he said, I shall not today attempt to further define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography. And perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. How do you decide if this is pornography or art? It's really hard to say. He's like, but I know when I see it. How can you say if this is pornography or science, right? I mean, probably when you were in school, there were some things that you saw in your health book that you just wish you couldn't have seen. How do you decide that that's not or not? Well, you know when you see it. How do you know? It's hard to say. This isn't art. Because you can tell. And there's kind of something like that with culture. It's like it's hard to define what is culture, but you know it when you see it. And if we go from that, there are some things that when you see culture, you always see these things. Your textbook divides them up, and I think it's fine, into aspects and characteristics. All cultures have beliefs. That doesn't mean that every belief is a culture, but all cultures have beliefs. They all have these beliefs that culture has. All cultures have values. They value one thing over another. That doesn't. I also value one thing over another. The environment and everything when I got my plastic spoon. Because sometimes I value convenience more, and so that's but that doesn't mean I'm a culture. But all cultures have values, so you can kind of one of the things you know when you see it, that it's culture, it has values. All cultures world views. They see the world as being a particular way. All cultures have uh, rules. But just because it's rules doesn't it has rules doesn't mean it's a culture. Right? If you want to take the GRE, if you want to go to graduate school, you have to take this test first called the GRE. There's rules you have to follow if you want to take it. But it would be ridiculous to talk about a GRE taking culture because anybody who takes it only takes it once. You know, there's a culture around it. So there are rules, but just because there are rules, that doesn't necessarily make it a culture. Right? But all cultures have rules. All cultures have communication systems. If it doesn't have a communication system, it's not a culture. But just, you know, all cultures have communication systems. All large boats have communication systems. It doesn't make them a culture. Right? It's just so all cultures have social systems. So these are kind of some of the things. It's hard to define culture, but you know it when you see it. And one of the ways you know it when you see it is it has all of these aspects. Uh, it also has all these characteristics. All cultures are learned. I swim pretty much every day, except Sunday, or when something comes up. Right? So but I swim pretty much every day. But it would be ridiculous to say we swim every day in my and the reason is that's not something I learned from somebody. It's not been passed on to me. You must swim every day. It's just something I do. So it'd be ridiculous because I didn't learn it, right? I didn't learn it, and I'm not passing it on to somebody else. Saying you shall follow in my footsteps and swim every day. So a culture is learned, but not everything that's learned is culture. Your times tables were learned, right? But that's not culture. That's not. I mean, but all cultures are all cultures are tied to symbolic behavior. They're tied to words. Um, all cultures have what we call dynamic equilibrium, which means that they are both. Your textbook doesn't use that. I don't know why, because they don't overall shy away from large technical terms. They just put them in bold and define them, which is what textbooks are supposed to do. But this idea of dynamic equilibrium is dynamic means changing. That's what the word means. It means it changes. Cultures are constantly changing. They're not the same as they used to be. But they're also stable, stay the same over time. And finding that place where you can stay the same while you're changing, that's really where a culture is. Cultures have different levels. And so one of the things that you'll notice in the text is this thing. I'll go ahead and place it over there. Culture, so that because it's being recorded, even though Jose went away. So cultures have different levels. It's on page 58. Got this, macro, regional, national, co-cultural, organizational, family culture. They have different levels, and you're part of all of them. Most culture is mostly invisible to its members. I would say this is especially true of dominant cultures. It seems to be just what everybody's doing. why do you do that? And to try and explain your culture to us outside, well, it just makes sense to you. It's what you do because, of course, you do that. It's mostly your own culture for the most part is like really hard to figure out. Well, this is my culture. But I think it's less true of what we sometimes call target cultures, or target minorities, where you know um, to your culture because the dominant culture is constantly telling you you're doing it wrong. So I feel like in target cultures, it's not always as invisible. And culture is affected by the environment. Now, certainly, so are rock formations. That doesn't make them culture, but if it's not affected by the environment, it's probably not. Um, so go ahead. So that finally takes us to what the whole text is going to be about. What we're studying this semester is intercultural communication. And your textbook defines intercultural communication as communication in which cultural differences are large enough to impact the production and consumption. So we have all those definitions of communication, all these different understandings of culture. What intercultural communication is where the culture affects our ability to communicate, which isn't always the case. And so even though we've got two things here, we've got communication, which is kind of hard to define, and culture, which is kind of hard to define. And this semester, what we're doing is studying these two hard to define things where they affect each other. And so this is a kind of an important chapter to get through because the two central parts of what we do in this class come together here. But it's a good one. It's kind of hard. It's two hard things, but it's like really central to get this chapter down to go on to everything else. So that's basically it. Talk about what we're going to talk.
Just talk about the topic and like kind of like what specifically you want like included.
Okay, let's go ahead and pull that. Okay, this one's a little different. This one's a little different than a lot of the other things. What I'm wanting you to do this is go someplace and watch. And try and see what themes emerge from the conversation. So, kind of, maybe you go someplace and, one group of people is talking about the Super Bowl, another group of people is talking about The Witcher, and another group of people is talking about The Mandalorian. And in which case, you can kind of see that there's one theme. All of these people seem to be talking about stuff that they watched. So you go and watch people for about an hour or so, where there's a lot of people interact, and try and see what
Maybe anywhere.
anywhere where that you could where a lot of people are. So I mean, some obvious places, student life center, cafeteria, pretty obvious places. In fact, there's one student who did this assignment. She started out, what's now the student life center, had a different name for athletes, right? And she started writing, and she's gotten really into sports ethnographies now from it's just kind of become a thing that she does. And she's a graduate school. I think you keep doing it. But just kind of go in there and watch this. Go in wherever you go, where there's groups of people hanging. Well, the gym would be great, right? Or working. You know, people are having conversations all the time. So what are themes that are emerging? That's why I swim. I don't want to be a part of those conversations.
Yeah.
I don't want everybody to know.
Yeah. Can't hear anybody in the water.
Nope. That was a post.
Okay, sounds good. You acting,
And we'll pay back.
Okay, so
Okay.
have a good day. We'll see you later.
Okay. I will see you. And